this is going to be a special talk, as indeed they all have been. So thank you for coming. Nice to see old faces and some new ones today. Robert Wright was very kindly gave a quiet day last week, was it the week before? Yeah, recently, which was exceptionally good, and some of that was based on Merton, but we have a great deal more today to get our teeth into. If you have time afterwards, please look at the paintings which are around the church. They're in progression. Number 1 starts there. Number 12 starts just beside the door. So I won't say any more about Robert because he can then choose to say what he wants to say about himself. But I feel very grateful to him for accepting the invitation to give this talk. So, Robert, over to you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I think that Thomas Merton is one of the most significant religious figures of the 20th century. He was an immensely complex, humorous, holy, and human man. And in some ways it seems pretentious to even try to say anything about him. But I, along with countless thousands of people all over the world, have found him to be an important guide and mentor in their spiritual life. And as part of this course on the mystics, we are looking at Merton and the search for truth. Indeed, Merton's whole life was a search for truth. But in this search, he had to battle with conflicting tensions between the desire for solitude and the craving for attention. The search for fame and influence, as much as the humility on which the monastic life is built. And even the very questioning of his monastic vocation, much as he desired that. A monk for 27 years in one of the most austere religious communities. A mystic, as reflected in these paintings of mine. I don't think Georgie said they're my paintings, but they are my paintings. Which use his words as a title. So that's a picture of Thomas Merton. And I forgot to say, because I was on there and I didn't press the button, sorry. He was born in 1915 and died in 1968, as we shall see. So that painting in the corner there, at peace in sublime nothing, spirit laid hold in secret on the all. So they all have titles from Merton's own writings, and they are reflecting my reflection on his search for truth. He wrote 95 books, approximately 250 essays, and there are 21 books of selections of his writings by other authors. I'm still describing the complex person he is. He lived as a hermit for the last 3 years of his life. He was a poet, a theologian, a teacher, an artist, a photographer, a social activist. And he maintained a prolific correspondence throughout his life. I think the Bellarmine University holds 10,000 of his letters to 2,100 people. In fact, he was such a complex man that one could almost make him fit whatever argument you chose to propose. So how can we begin to make sense of this complex man? As I said, I'm an artist, and I want to use Merton's own artistic development as a framework to try and answer this question that we've raised. And I hope that some of my own paintings will help us reflect on this remarkable man's life as well. The child of 2 artists, Merton perceptively said that art enables us to find ourselves and lose ourselves at the same time. And perhaps in this paper we should find that he had to lose himself to find himself. He was born in January 1915 in Prague in the Eastern Pyrenees to Ruth and Owen. Owen was a quite successful New Zealand artist, and Ruth died of cancer when he was 6, unable to permit Merton to visit her as she was dying, which probably had a lasting effect upon him. Attending public school at Oakham and University at Cambridge for a year, he lived, I think we would say, wildly, following his desires and imagining that this was freedom. In fact, he fathered a child while he was at Cambridge, the reason he left Cambridge, and I think that probably working out the monastic vocation was all to do with his guilt over that. He travelled, he squandered his inheritance, and sought both pleasure and passion indiscriminately. And after that year at Cambridge, and alienating a godfather, he reflected as he crossed the Atlantic to live with his grandparents in America. This is a quotation. "It didn't take very much reflection on the year I'd spent at Cambridge to show me that all my dreams of fantastic pleasures and delights were crazy and absurd, and that everything I'd reached out for had turned to ashes in my hands, and that I myself into the bargain had turned out to be an extremely unpleasant sort of person, vain, self-centered, dissolute, weak, irresolute, sensual, obscene, and proud. I was a mess," he writes. However, he finished his university studies at Columbia University in New York, where we can see the early stages of his artistic life. Here he drew sketches for the university magazine, often sexy, sometimes funny, sometimes rather heavy and pedantic, sometimes political. Just occasionally, he drew more reflective works, exploring the work of contemporary artists such as Picasso and Paul Klee. Amidst all the usual activities of student life, he also made significant and lifelong friendships, and he discovered William Blake, who was to be an important influence on him throughout his spiritual life. At this time, he became a Roman Catholic and explored the idea of joining the Franciscans, but when he was rejected by them, he began to consider becoming a Trappist monk, the strict Cistercian life, whose life is marked by austerity and silence. And so in 1941, December the 10th, when he was 27, Merton entered the Trappist monastery of the Abbey of Our Lady in Gethsemane in Kentucky. In The Sign of Jonas in 1956, he wrote, "My intention is to give myself entirely and without compromise to whatever work God wants to perform in me and through me. But this gift is not something absolutely blind and without definition. It's already defined by the fact that God has given me a contemplative vocation. It means renouncing busyness, ambitions, honours and pleasures, and other activities of the world." So he was writing that 15 years after entering the monastery. And so the painting, the first one, the green one over there, looking at some of the questions, not the answers, some of the questions, I think he was still looking for those. And then the purplish grey one, a beauty not yet seen. At this stage, I think he still hadn't come to see many of the things he was later to see in life. And then the third one, into complex painting, when we're never still, we never face ourselves. When we're never still, we never face ourselves. I think that's very important as we consider Merton's life. As you may know, the Trappist life is centred on prayer, with 7 offices of the day starting at 4 in the morning, with the final office at 7 at night, before the monks retire to bed. And in these years, Merton was obviously working out what it meant to be a monk. And we find this in his drawings, the second stage of his drawings, many hundreds of which are either earnest and rather unhappy monks, or images of the Virgin Mary or of young women, reflecting both his devotion to Mary, I think the loss of his mother, and in psychological terms, his struggle with the feminine, his anima. There's a drawing of a young woman. There is a hint in his journals that the physicality and silence of drawing helped him restore his focus and perhaps bring him some comfort in difficult times. Is it too fanciful to say that in these drawings we see both his personal conversion and the conversion of his art? His spirituality was based on a concern for the whole person in all aspects of their life, spiritual, psychological, bodily, and cultural. In his early years in the monastery, much of his writing was concerned with the Cistercian fathers and with monastic renewal, although he did, of course, write the profoundly influential The Seven-Storey Mountain, which many of you may have read. And he was quite clear that when structures and systems became artificial and eclipsed the work of the heart, they ceased to be true to the Cistercian tradition and must be revised. Although Father Louis, who changed his name on entering the monastery, obeyed the abbot's request that he continued to write that autobiography, The Seven-Storey Mountain, as a Cistercian monk called to the life of solitude and happiness, and struggling to understand what that meant for him, he will, having a sharp mind, have realized that the publication of this autobiography and his monastic journal, The Sign of Jonas, a few years later, would open him to criticism. But I think that even in those early days, he knew somewhere within this complex being of himself that his way of understanding his life as a monk and as a contemplative would allow his readers to identify with him, as indeed proved to be the case. There began to be a constant stream of young men coming to the monastery to join it. I think I read that 2,000 men had come. They hadn't all stayed, of course. 2,000 men had come to explore a vocation as a result of his writings. He knew he had to write. Just another little complication to this vocation of his. And the Abbey of Gethsemane grew, as I say, in numbers as a result of this writing, attracting large numbers of men. And his writings, of course, are still widely read today. The fourth painting, Humility is Necessary if we're to see our wounds. And then, in the next arch, Experimental Contact with God. Both reflecting on this period of his life. And the Merton scholar Michael Higgins described Merton as an outsider attempting to reintegrate shattered humanity, who was at once a poet and visual artist as well as a social critic. Merton's understanding of what it means to be contemplative and what it means to be a contemplative evolved during these years of Gethsemane, as we'd expect with a man who possessed such a fertile and active mind. In his early years as a monk, Merton had a narrow understanding of a monk's vocation, but after years of meditation and spiritual growth, he came to see the contemplative life as a dependence on God. He said, what is called the contemplative life is really a life arranged in such a way that a person can more easily and more simply and more naturally live in an awareness of direct dependence on God, almost with the sense of realizing consciously at every moment how much we depend on him and receive from him directly everything that comes to us as a pure gift. Experience, taste in our hearts the love of God in this gift, the delicacy and the personal attention of God to us in his merciful love. This is complicated quotation there, but I think the key to it is living in an awareness of direct dependence on God. we'll see that developing as he grows into this vocation. Undoubtedly, Merton didn't see his monastic vocation as a flight from the world, as that phrase would normally be understood, but rather as a monastic distancing, stepping back in order to be able to see more clearly. Despite his desire for solitude, and perhaps because of it, Merton never ignored the world. He remained engaged with it and distraught by the anxieties and suffering of the world, incensed by oppression and injustice, and outraged by racism and the threat of nuclear warfare. Merton was quickly given demanding roles in the monastery, but his letters and journals show us that he had a deeply felt need for more and more prayer and solitude. As he searched for solitude, something he really didn't find in the monastery, in 1953 he was allowed to use a small tool shed during certain hours of the day, and not exclusively either. How about that for a centre of prayer? St. Anne's. But in 1960, he was by this time the master of the scholars and the novice master, and he was writing all these books on the Cistercian tradition. In 1960, he was allowed by the abbot to use the Hermitage, a larger and more substantial cinder block building, less than a mile from the monastery, still in the grounds, originally built as a meeting room for visiting groups, where he was able to spend more time in solitude. And the annual monastic retreat in 1965, in January, was significant for Merton, confirming him in his vocation and clarifying his need for solitude. As he wrote, "I'm just beginning to awaken and to realize how much more awakening is to come." It also served to confirm him in his view that spiritually he must renounce all ambition and self-seeking, both in his work in the monastery and his external contacts, of whom there were many. He said, "I'm so tied up in all of this that I don't know where to start getting free." And he was all the time knocking on the abbot's door, asking for permission to go to find more solitude, and looking at other monasteries. But in August 1965, after 24 years in the community, this spiritual life is a lifetime's journey, after 24 years in the community and countless prayers and petitions, he was finally allowed to be a hermit by the abbot, Father James Fox. There's a picture of the hermitage, giving him, for the final 3 years of his life, considerably more solitude than had been possible before. Again, outside the hermitage. Finally, as he put in a Christmas letter to friends, "I'm trying to do the things I came here for, a less cluttered life, fewer chores and responsibilities, less correspondence." And in his final official conference as a novice master at the very beginning of August, he'd asked for the novices' prayers. He said, "All I ask you to pray for is that above all I should completely forget my own will and completely surrender to the will of God, because this is all I want to do. I don't want to go up there and just sit and learn a new form of prayer or something like that. It's a question of total surrender to God. The ambition of those Greek monks on Mount Athos is that you get to the point where you are kissed by God." There are tapes of some of Merton's conferences, and I wish you could hear them to hear his voice actually saying those words, because they are so quintessentially Merton. Contemplation is the highest expression of man's intellectual and spiritual life. It is that life itself, fully awake, fully active, fully aware that it is alive. It is spontaneous awe at the sacredness of life, of being. It is gratitude for life, for awareness, and for being. Remember, we're just 3 more years to live at this time. He entered the Abbey in 1941, we're now see this great development in his spiritual life. My own view is that these years in the hermitage are immensely significant, and indeed of a different order from all those years before, much as he wrote during those times, and everything else. But living on the edge, both inside a monastic community and outside it in his hermitage, in this much longed for solitude, Merton can learn to live deliberately and reflectively. He allows himself to be vulnerable, as Monica Weiss has said, to be lured into the wilderness like Hosea, so that God can possess his heart, knowing himself to be, as Jonathan Montalvo has said, God's bait, both pursuer and pursued. I haven't really mentioned Merton's poetry, but Bonnie Thurston, the American theologian, has pointed out Merton's mature spiritual poetry is where we find him most clearly and succinctly describing the experience of ultimate transformation. In his poem Stranger, he writes, "When no one listens to the quiet trees, when no one notices the sun in the pool, when no one feels the first drop of rain, or sees the last star, or hails the first morning of a giant world where peace begins and rages end, one bird sits still, watching the work of God. One turning leaf, 2 falling blossoms, 10 circles upon the pond, 1 cloud upon the hillside, 2 shadows in the valley, and the light strikes home. Now dawn commands the capture of the tallest fortune, the surrender of no less marvellous prize. Closer and clearer than any wordy master, thou inward stranger whom I have never seen, deeper and cleaner than the clamorous ocean, seize up my silence, hold me in thy hand. Now act is waste, and suffering undone, laws become prodigals, limits are torn down, for envy has no property, and passion is none. Look, the vast night stands still, our cleanest light is one." Here we see these ordinary things, in these ordinary things, glimpses of the divine, the cosmic, universal, and unifying truth of God. Even if no one is watching, the poem tells us that God's work is just going on. And we could imagine the mystic Thomas Merton walking in the woods behind the hermitage, echoing the words of Job, "I had heard of thee by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees thee." There are some really wonderful writings of this time, of deer and trees, the sky, and clearly he is being kissed by God. We also see a profound and significant shift in Merton's art in 1960, when he began to consider trying some abstract drawings for a proposed but never finished book called Art and Worship, with a young art historian. Although he himself had struggled with modern art, remarkably, within weeks of trying his hand at, as he called it, some abstract-looking art, Father Louis discovered its potential not only for his own religious development, but also as a record of that development and as a way of sharing it with others. The Merton Centre at Bellarmine University holds 1,000 of his images, and actually 2 of my paintings as well, which I'm rather pleased with. So, 1,000 of his images, it's an important aspect of Merton's complex personality. Although there is a very significant book, Angelic Mistakes, written by Roger Lipsey, I think this is an area of Merton's studies that would be well worth a closer look. This is a time when Merton is growing more deeply into his vocation as a contemplative, and we can see that visually most clearly, interestingly, in his photographs. There's another abstract thing. He's the son of 2 artists, so he's digging deeply here into his roots. And through his art is responding to the cultural and spiritual forces that were present in the Americas of 1950 and 1960. He had a friend who gave him a camera, and the friend developed his films. The friend's son, and he developed the films. And they'd send back, I don't know what you call them, you know, those sort of a sheet of lots of little photographs. And they'd say, these are the good ones, and Merton would say, no, that's the one I want, or that one. Not the ones that the photographers expected, but the ones that Merton felt were reflecting his relationship with God, such as that. Sorry, I can't see it awfully well. It's important for us to note the distance of his work from the traditional church symbolism, influenced as Merton was by both his deep and complex relationship with Zen Buddhism, which I haven't mentioned yet, and through his many friends within the abstract expressionist movement of New York. In his art, he was able to push the boundaries. The abbot, Don James Fox, gave him considerable, but not entirely unlimited, freedom in this area, as far as the art was concerned, in his drawings themselves, his writings about them, and the exhibitions. Difficult for us to realise it if we're not monastic ourselves. But I remember staying at a Carthusian house where they couldn't ask for salt or pepper at lunch. They could point out someone else's, so they'd knock on the table and say, Brother Andrew hasn't got a mouse in his soup, as a way of explaining, there's a mouse in my soup. They couldn't say that. They went for a walk, and they were told who they could walk with on the journey out. Then they were told by the abbot or the prior who they could walk with on their way back. So this is an area, this art, where Merton was given some quite considerable freedom to explore his own understanding, his own thoughts. And in an important way in which he could explore this vocation as a contemplative, relatively free from the constrictions of both the Roman Catholic Church and the Cistercian Order of the Strict Observance, to give it its full title. Another aspect of Merton's art at this time is an exploration of the calligraphic drawings. See his calligraphy. Zen was fundamental to Merton's art, based on a close friendship with the Japanese Zen master, Dr. Suzuki. And in the Hermitage, Merton hung a scroll given to him by Dr. Suzuki, which in calligraphy said harmony, reverence, purity, tranquility. And Japanese calligraphy is, amongst other things, a teaching technique, whereby the Zen monk sends what is essential in his monastery, harmony, reverence, purity, tranquility, back into the homes of those to whom the monk is giving the scroll. And I would suggest that Merton's images, sometimes freely given, sometimes exchanged for small necessities. If I give you this picture, could you send me some paper, please? There's a little lovely bit of writing, a letter, in which he's asking for different bits of paper, different scraps of paper that he can paint on. Brushes and so on. The bartering, that can also be seen as a means of Merton communicating what he knew and sensed of the order of things, of our human nature, and of the search for truth. Another abstract there. Having moved to the Hermitage in 1965, though Father Louis remained a much visited hermit, both a problem and a delight to him, he found there enough solitude to challenge his soul, shatter the routine stability of the monastery, and open up new possibilities for him. People going on retreat to the monastery would creep out and creep up to the Hermitage, trying to see Merton, trying to see where he was, quite apart from all the people who came to visit him by appointment. But here also, as Lipsy points out, in solitude, Merton, real silence, real solitude, peace. Father Louis was able to explore the endlessly surprising correlation between marks on the paper and marks in one's own heart and mind. And we find him referring to his art as collaboration with solitude. Black and white painting with the red square in the corner, I nothing am thy all. We found unexpectedly a new language, a new way of searching, a new way of recording his spiritual journey. and a provocative new way of sharing with others. The red one, a peace in the possession of sublime nothing, the spirit laid hold in secret. There are some postcards of that painting in the next one. And the third yellow one, which is held at Bellarmine University, if you'd like to take them, I don't know, just put a little bit of money there to help cover the cost. The blue one, Our Real Journey in Life is Interior. And then the next one, the final one over there, In Quiet He Kindles with Consuming Charity. Merton is now deeply into his vocation as a contemplative, living in the hermitage. But over the years, Merton had become more aware of humanity's extraordinary temptation towards inhumanity, and had written extensively and courageously about the general dehumanization that this led to. One might have thought a contemplative monk was immune from such thoughts, but Merton wrote not just about monastic reform, but also about racism, human rights, nuclear proliferation, human freedom from programming, and the inhuman demands of materialistic society. Merton knew that this more hidden and seemingly sheltered life was in reality much less defended against the world than he might have hoped. As the strategic air command bombers flew overhead on their way to and from the nearby airbase, he could actually see the bombs hanging out of the bomb bays above him. He was confronted by the events involving the Roman Catholic peace movement, and had written, I am, so to speak, making my novitiate as a hermit of sorts, and I have my hands full with this. It's a full-time job, just coping with one's own damn mind in solitude, without getting wrought up about what appear to be the vagaries of others. But that didn't last for long. Contemplation led Merton deeper and deeper into the world, its beauty and its tragedy. And for Merton, contemplation is the only true basis for effective political engagement, since it roots us not in the demands of the egocentric self, with which Merton struggled all his life, but in universal love and compassion. Although he was always committed to Gethsemane as part of his struggle with his vocation, he had on a number of occasions applied to the abbot unsuccessfully to move to different orders, different monasteries. And he had found the constant censorship of the Cistercian order immensely frustrating. But whilst he sometimes spoke critically of his fellow monks, often grumpily, it tended to be in a way that was always humorous. So when a friend, Linda Henry, designed a letterhead that featured the word, "The monks are moving," he asked if he could have some blank sheets for some of his own correspondence with that heading. He said, "Only thing is, I wonder if the monks are moving. Everything I do gives me scruples about being identified with this stupid rhinocerotic outfit that charges backwards into the jungle with portentous snuffling and then bursts out of the dense sugarcane with a roar into the most unlikely places." We can probably understand the Cistercian censor's anxiety of Merton's pacifism and his implicit or direct critique of a society driven by violent competitiveness and anxiety. In a recent book, it said that Merton's works demonstrate a radical suspension of neoliberal assumptions, a systematic decentering of Enlightenment assumptions, a preference for the poor, a proto-liberation theology, an emphasis upon concrete experience, and the value of a plurality of religious expressions. Moreover, they provide a reading of history in which technological progress stands under judgment. We're talking of a monk in an obscure monastery. Well, it was obscure till he went there, a Cistercian monastery in the middle of Kentucky. Deeply involved, this monk deeply involved with society. Certainly he had to struggle with the strict censorship of his superiors, censorship probably not aimed at combing out errors at all, but purely and simply preventing the publication of material that doesn't look good. Merton felt that the censors were trying to contain him in that area because he was writing things that you wouldn't expect a monk to write. Whereas the official Roman Catholic censors were trying to see that it was strictly in line with the teaching of the Church. That faced Merton with a challenge. It was immensely annoying to Merton, but he recognised that his commitment to non-violence demanded patient endurance rather than confrontation, and the necessity, as he said in a letter to a peace activist, the need to work out something sensible in this absurd censorship tool. It needed patience so that transformation might take place, where the adversaries were convinced and won over, rather than defeated but left unconvinced. But perhaps, as his friend Jim Forrester suggested, the order's censorship sharpened Merton's compassion for, understanding of, and connection with those who suffer, clarifying his understanding of the Church and its mission. As we come towards our conclusion, I'd like to quote Merton again. The hermit knows where he's going, but he's not sure of his way. He just knows by going there. He doesn't see the way beforehand, and when he arrives, he arrives. His arrivals are usually departures from anything that resembles a way. This grey painting here, slowly, slowly, Christ comes through the rains. So it's not a great sudden moment of enlightenment, it is this gradual growing into vocation as a contemplative. And I think we can get a real sight into the place that Merton sought and came to as he grew into his vocation as a contemplative in one of his prayers, which I think he may have actually written before moving permanently into the hermitage. It's a prayer to God my Father on the vigil of Pentecost. Today, Father, the blue sky praises you. The delicate green and orange flowers of the tulip and poplar praise you. The distant blue hills praise you with the sweet-smelling air that is full of brilliant light. The bickering flycatchers praise you with the lowing wolves and the quails that whistle over there. And I too, Father, praise you with these creatures. You've made us all together, and you've placed me here this morning in the midst of them. And here I am. For a long time I prayed in the years that have passed, and I was in darkness and sorrow and confusion. No doubt the confusion was my own fault. No doubt my own will was the root of my sorrow, and I regret it, O merciful Father. But whatever may have been my sin, the prayer of your friends for me, and my own prayers were answered, and I am here in this hermitage before you, and here you see me. Here you love me. Here you ask the response of my own love and of my confidence. Here you ask me to be nothing else than your friend. To be your friend is simply to accept your friendship, because it is your friendship. And this friendship is your life, the spirit of your Son. You called me here to be your Son, to be born over again, repeatedly in your light, and in knowledge and consideration and gratitude and poverty and praise. So the gold painting there, this title here is The Thing God Has Willed For. With a great sense of glory, but also there are arrows going sharply off in opposite directions. Hint of the cross, perhaps, and then the confusing ambiguity of the grey and blue in the centre, and what angle they're actually at. Here is the thing God has willed for me. Not an easy life, a complex one, but upheld within the glory of God. It's almost unbelievable that in 1968, Father Louis was given permission to go to address a meeting of Benedictine monks and theologians in Bangkok, to meet Dalai Lama while he was there, to engage with Buddhist monks as well. Although that did, of course, reflect, I haven't mentioned this, his conviction of the importance of interreligious dialogue. But in his last talk at Summit Prakan in Thailand, Merton said, the monk, and I think those of us who don't have the vocation to be religious, can also desire this. The monk is a man who has attained, or is about to attain, or seeks to attain full realization. A man knows he's found his vocation when he stops thinking about how to live and begins to live. He dwells in the centre of society as one who has attained realization. Not that he's acquired unusual or esoteric information, but he's come to experience the ground of his being in such a way that he knows the secret liberation and can somehow communicate this to others. Thomas Merton finishes his autobiography, Seven Storey Mountain, with the phrase, sit finis libri non finis prevendi. The book is finished, seeking goes on. Indeed it did, for a lifetime. As he wrote elsewhere, the contemplative is not the man or woman who has fiery visions, but simply he or she who has risked his or her mind in the desert beyond language and beyond ideas. Simply he was writing in 1968, simply he who has risked his mind in the desert beyond language and beyond ideas. Final painting, our destiny is to go beyond. He died accidentally, electrocuting himself in the shower. He was hopelessly impractical, having just given a lecture at a Benedictine conference outside Bangkok. Ironically, his body was flown home in the bomb bay of an SAC military aircraft. At dusk on December the 17th, 1968, under a light snowfall, his body was laid to rest in the monastic cemetery at the monastery of Kentucky, beneath the solitary cedar tree. A simple white cross marks his grave. No different from the rest of the monks who are buried there.
Robert is willing to take questions if any of you would like to ask him something or make a comment.
Just two questions. Who took that photograph?
This one?
Yeah.
In all likelihood, it was his dear friend,
It's okay, doesn't matter. Second question. Those like myself have never read anything by Thomas Merton. What would be a good one to start with?
There's a very good book of Esther Duval's over there, which is for sale. If you want to buy one, make a check out to Esther. And that's a 7-day retreat with Thomas Merton. It's a very helpful introduction to it. Probably, if we're going to read Thomas Merton, Essential Writings by Christine Bochen, B-O-C-H-E-N, she's an American academic. Thomas Merton, Essential Writings, probably be a good place to start. Biographies, there are several of them. Monica Furlong wrote a very accessible and interesting one, just called Merton Biography.
To what extent do you think that Thomas Merton's 27 years of contemplation and solitude were driven by beginning, you mentioned that he's had a child, and that he's alienated a godfather. Those seem to be very, very fundamental.
Yes, I think that's right. If you read his writings in the 1940s, 41, that sort of time, he seemed to be very much driven by a need to seek absolution for that. Interestingly, when he explored joining the Franciscans, that was a key issue, and there are two different versions of understandings of it. One is that he was so recently converted as a Roman Catholic, the Franciscans wanted him to spend more time, but another was that he was not sorted in that whole area of his wild youth. I think that was something that was driving him.
We know that these things, particularly having a child that was then alienated, estranged from, can have a lifelong impact.
Indeed.
Did he ever find the time to learn his heart?
No, and I don't think anyone knows who that child is. I don't think they do. Interestingly, but what I didn't say is a whole other area. He was occasionally allowed out of the monastery because he was quite a neurotic person and had a lot of illnesses and things, and had to go into the hospital quite often. And while he was there, he visited various friends in Louisville. But he had an operation, and he fell in love with the nurse. They had a very intense relationship. He was a monk at the time. And I think he went back to the monastery. I think she came to visit him, even at the monastery. And then he suddenly realized that he was a monk, and he felt his vocation as a monk, his commitment to that overrode the relationship. I think he probably treated, she's known as M, he probably treated her rather badly. But this is the complexity of it, which you're pointing to. He understood so much more about love through that. He wrote a lot about love. And we saw those pictures a picture of a young woman, one of the early drawings. He was clearly trying to work that out. And he learnt a lot about love through that relationship with M. But it's the last thing in the world you'll think a monk's doing.
Thank you for your wonderful talk, and it's lovely to hear an artist talking about these things. I wondered whether he had a friendship with William Johnston, because they obviously both knew the Suzuki and were both very influenced by Zen Buddhist ideas. So could you tell me whether they did know each other and whether they got on?
I don't really know. I'm sure you're right. They will have known each other. He did have a vast correspondence with people. I just can't recall whether they were friends, but I would suspect that they had been.
I'd like to ask you whether there was a similar conflict between his desire for contemplation, silence and seclusion, and his equally powerful desire to write, to go out. At odds. There's two strands.
Well, the problem is it isn't just two strands. There are so many strands in his life. But I think that at the heart of it, there is beautiful writing, as we saw in that prayer, where he really finds God in just a simple thing like a ripple in a pond, for instance. He can see the divine in that. And he just needed to write. Interestingly, the monastery clearly saw that, because they got him to write very quickly. And the Pope even asked him to write about contemplative prayer. And it's a very interesting correspondence, which Merton is saying he doesn't really know anything about it, and he's the wrong person to ask. But he had this great need to share. And listening to him talking to the novices is fascinating on some of these tapes. He spent one whole lesson talking about the pigs on the farm. And they all said they learned so much. I only read about that. I don't know what he said, but I think he just couldn't help communicating.
Did he write about more formal theological kind?
Yes, he did.
I mean, and did he have any particular doubts or questions that he... Did he have any particular doubts or questions he raised with the more formal doctrines of the Catholic Church?
Well, in those early days, he was very... he was an academic writer on particularly Cistercian matters. He was such a big thinker. He was ahead of the game in a way. He had great friendship, for instance, with Don Volchin. Some of you may have known Don when he was here. He had a great friendship with him, and they met and they corresponded. And he learned so much about Wales, his Welsh heritage, and Esther de Val is very keen on that. So he was challenging, and with his interreligious dialogue, he was challenging. I can't give you a very accurate answer. There might be someone else who could on that. But
Ask you another question. Of course, I was very quite a troublesome person to have around in many ways. And the first thing that I read of his purely by chance I didn't know who he was on the subject of nuclear liberation. And I was astonished later on to find that this was also a trappist.
yes.
And I had heard, although perhaps it's nonsense, that there are some conspiracy theories about his death. But actually it wasn't a bit accident, as I was very practical. But people may have wanted to do it. And I wonder if you...
I've heard those that the CIA wanted to get rid of him because he was a real thorn in the flesh of American society at that time.
But I wondered also whether he was writing, his contribution was or is truly valued by his community and by the wider ecclesiastical community.
Oh yes, I'm sure. I mean, it's fascinating going to a Merton conference. There are scholars from all over the world who come and are deeply committed. The community, our friends around Merton is as strong today. It's his 100th anniversary next year. There's a big conference in Bellarmine, actually, in Kentucky, and Rowan's going to speak at that. It's this paradox I've been trying to point to that you found yourself when you opened that book. I mean, he is a Trappist and very committed to that. There is a whole discussion. I don't think it was the CIA. I think he just got out of the bath and he was wet and picked up the fan, and that was it. But there's a whole discussion as to whether he would have come back to the monastery. Some people think he'd moved so far he would have not gone back to the monastery. I'm listening to people who knew him and thinking around it. I think he would have gone. He was deeply, passionately committed Roman Catholic. But he, in the sense of Catholic, he was truly Catholic. All exhausted, I think.
So we have about 6 or 7 minutes before 1:30, which is our cut-off time. What I would like to do first of all is to thank Robert on your behalf. And secondly, I would like to invite you to look at these pictures and spend a little time, if you've got the time. They do repay careful consideration. And the longer you can spend with each one, better. Or come back, we're open at lunchtimes all through the week between 12 and 2. Do come and look at them before the end of June, and it'll be too late. Anyhow, thank you for coming, and there's a basket at the bottom if you'd like to make a donation to us for our costs.